services. I am a therapist, and tonight, though, I am wearing a hat as a facilitator for this presentation. And the purpose of our first webinar is to learn how to talk with children about events related to race and social justice issues that are affecting our community. So tonight, it is important for us to, as we come away with this, that we'll just get a brief overview of the history of racism in this country. We'll be able to identify racism as a type of trauma. We'll also talk about us understanding our own implicit bias, tips for talking to children about racism, and then what are some resources that are available to you. And again, at any time, if there are any questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the chat room. So if we were all together in a room, I would ask each of you to take a moment to reflect on these three questions. You can put your responses to these questions in the chat room, in the chat area, and I can share them if you'd like with the rest of the listening audience. But the first question is to reflect upon what was your own upbringing? How were you brought up? And the second question has to do with how did you hear about racism growing up? Did you hear about it from media? Did you hear about it from the news, or sort of listening to folks sitting around a table talking about it? And then the last question is, what did you assume about racism growing up? So take a minute to just reflect upon your own upbringing. What did you hear about racism growing up? And what did you assume? So I never want to ask a question of others that I'm not willing to ask of myself. So I will just share that my upbringing is that I was born in the South and raised in the North. And I really only heard about racism when I would come South and would visit families. And what I assumed kind of growing up is that it wasn't something that happened to me and to my family because of the type of insulated community where we live. So this picture I was drawn to because of the message that this person is holding. And it says it's a privilege to educate yourself about racism instead of experiencing it. And I think it's important that as we live in an age of misinformation and lots of stuff that's out there, but when it comes to talking to our children, it's very helpful if we know the facts and we have some education that we can pass on to them. It is said that knowledge is power. And so in the next couple of slides, it's just a very quick overview about our history and about what are indeed our rights. This is just a basic timeline that gives an overview of history of racism in America. We were brought to this country in 1619, and you can see that slavery lasted up until 1865. And those 89 years are called segregation, or we might hear the terminology Jim Crow, a period. And then in 1954 onward really begins an era of our civil rights. And so there's slavery, segregation, and civil rights. And today we've been hearing a lot of talk about kind of critical race theory. And to put it down into just one or two sentences, that really is about our understanding of what have been the legal laws and policies that had been put forth a long time ago that really gives us our what we are entitled to and what are indeed our rights. And so if we look to the Constitution, which is a federal document, the 13th Amendment was in 1865. Slavery was actually abolished in this country. And in 1868, the 14th Amendment was written, and it stated that all persons, whether born or not naturalized in the US, that were citizens. The 15th Amendment came about in 1870, which forbade any state to deprive a citizen of his right to vote because of race, color, or previous servitude. And then with the Civil Rights era that ushered in 1954, Separate but Equal Education Act, and then in 1965 was the Civil Rights Voting Act. In that, if we look at what the US Constitution tells us are our rights, and these are law, that much has changed since then. And although we received the right to vote in 1965, here we are in 2021, and what is before the US Congress is to renew the Civil Rights Voting Act. And we see sweeping across the United States, various states have enacted much more restrictive laws around voting. So in many ways, some might say that things have changed, but some have not. These are just a few resources that you can actually go to online to get additional information and to even share and watch with your children or with other adults. The 1619 project is readily available, and it is, again, very much a topic of discussion across the states, and many states are saying that project 1619, which gives the history of American slavery, should not be taught in schools. This was another picture. I think that there are powerful messages that are given by a picture. The saying is a picture is 1,000 words. So this young lady is holding up a sign that says, "I wake up Black." And every time I see it, it reminds me that we can't hide that we are persons of color, and that every day we live with the realities of what it means to be a person of color in America. So as a therapist, if we examine what does that mean to wake up Black, from a mental health perspective, it means that we can experience something that is called PTSD. And PTSD is post-traumatic disorder. And I highlighted part of the root word of traumatic disorder to show trauma. And so it is what happens when trauma is experienced. So just to give us a little overview of what is PTSD, and just a working definition of it. PTSD is a major life-threatening event. And so trauma can take place in various forms. Trauma could be about any type of abuse that is physical, emotional, sexual abuse. Trauma could be caused by natural events. Trauma could be major illnesses, being in major accidents, but trauma. And it is something that if we think about our lives, that many individuals may have in one form or another experienced some type of trauma in their lives. Another type of trauma is intergenerational trauma. So as we talk about slavery, think about our great grandparents who may have been slaves or um, been sharecroppers, and think about the what they may have experienced. And so those traumatic events and the effects of those events kind of get passed on from generation to generation to generation. In today's time, there might be a household where the head of household has experienced some kind of trauma. And not only has the caregiver experienced trauma, but perhaps the child has experienced trauma as well. And when we think about intergenerational trauma, we have to think about vicarious trauma. And that's the type of trauma where it does not happen directly to you, but it is a trauma that perhaps you have witnessed or you have been exposed. So think about what happens in communities where there is community violence. Perhaps you did not know the individual, but you may have looked out a window and saw someone being shot, or you hear the sounds of gunfire outside your window. And while you may not see it, you know that something has happened and a life has been lost. Vicarious trauma. Last summer, we watched on TV many of the protests, the filming of George Floyd. We think about 9/11. We may not have been there, but we certainly witnessed it. And this is a form of an example of trauma. And because tonight we're talking about racism, it really is, there is racial trauma. And it's defined as the mental and emotional injury that is caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. And I know that tonight it's about talking to your children about racism, but I believe that it's helpful for us to know as adults some of these working definitions, and it gives us a context by which, when we are prepared, that will enable us to be able to talk to our children. With racial trauma, this is more examples of how racial trauma is defined. And sometimes you might be in a crowd and someone will say something and you kind of go, did they just say that? Did I really just hear that comment made? We know police harassments, body searches and assaults within the workplace. There can be racial trauma in the workplace. You go to work every day, you work as hard as, say, a counterpart who is a non-person of color, yet they get the promotion, and there's no difference between skill set and qualification. We know that community violence is a form of trauma. Your medical experience, whether if you're having to deal with some type of major life-threatening illness, or if you are not given adequate care because of race, and that can make all the difference in your recovery, in your experience. Incarceration, when you look at the numbers of who is incarcerated, but there is the mass incarceration of persons of color, and often for no reason. And we know that with immigration and deportation that we see happening, it's really based upon race. And that can be traumatic because families are separated from one another. And we know that with children particularly, there is a separation and families are torn apart. This next slide really is about us being aware of what are our own implicit biases. And those are really just the unconscious associations or feelings that we have about someone that is other than us. And so in cases of racial discrimination, it's an implicit bias. We know that we might hear a name and we might say, oh, that person is of a different race. But we just assume because we hear a name. And that happens in the workplace when people are applying for a job. They might see a name and make the association without ever meeting the person that they are a person of color. So this next activity is just something that if you have paper in front of you, but it is to list who are the 10 people, 10 trusted people in your circle. Maybe the number is not 10, but I would ask you to list a first name, list their gender, their race and ethnicity, their age, what is their sexual orientation, education, and you could expand this to include additional categories, but take a moment and make the list and let's see what you see when you're done. So if you're still working on this or you haven't completed it, as you are doing this, if you begin to take a look, what does it reveal to you as you are looking at it? Are you seeing that your circle includes a specific gender of individuals? Are they all of the same race and ethnicity? Are they the same age? Same with sexual orientation, same educational background? There was a question asked on the pretest about what can you do to end racism. And sometimes we have our own biases, but within our circle, if we are within same circle, same community, sometimes we might have bias because we're not having any interaction or conversation with persons who are of different genders, different race or ethnicity, even age. I laugh and say that I'm of the AARP crew, and so therefore, who I am around, we're all about the same age, but I don't have a lot of interaction with the millennials. I don't have a lot of interaction with young African-American males. And so that I may make my implicit bias might be that as I'm driving and I see young African-American males under a certain age on a corner, that I implicitly might have a judgment or a belief about who they are, even though we are of the same race. And sometimes without knowing or having the dialogue, I never know the story of a young man who is half my age and even more. I don't know their background, but I make an assumption. And it could be about anyone that we might see in our community. I personally did this exercise and it made me think, I think I have a little bit of work to do and that I won't get my information from looking at TV, but I will actively make an effort to seek out and have a conversation with someone other than individuals who are persons of color, who are of the same age, and even of the same sexual orientation.
I have to add, this was interesting for me too, because I'm looking at my list and everyone is the same race, ethnicity, almost the same gender. So this is really interesting. I like this. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And it doesn't mean that we have to run out today, but it's just for our own awareness. And if we're ever going to bridge, I don't know, a gap or whatever, that even if you're going to a store and someone engages you in conversation, you're in a different place. That's sort of how it starts, but that is the moment. Thank you for sharing, Danielle. So this little video, I'm thinking the same thing was going to happen as it did before in terms of the volume. But remember that I talked about implicit bias. Imagine what happens to our children, to our daughters, our nieces, our nephews, the children that we are working with, just children in general. But what about what happens when they go to school? Remember, I talked about implicit biases. Well, what do you think happens when a child goes to school and they are interacting with teachers who may not be of the same ethnicity or race, but the hidden bias that this young boy, the bias that is hidden is that his mom is single head of household, that he lives in a certain community, and that there are multiple children in the home, and that his parents are uneducated. Biases, and accordingly treated as such. Or a bias if this young boy may be very energetic in the classroom, but something happens, something gets broken, but this young boy is the young man that's always getting trouble because the hidden implicit bias is that is what young boys do, that they are troublemakers. And therefore, if young boys are hanging on a corner in front of a store, implicitly the store owner is going to make that call because they think that they're about to be robbed or something is going to happen, but implicit biases. So it's not only our own as adults, but our children are also exposed to those biases and they don't even really know that it is happening to them. But again, it is the exposure. And so our own biases, particularly people who are in position of authority, that we're bringing that into any interactions and situations that we might have with younger individuals. So our biases are hidden. And occasionally, as happened to me about a few weeks ago, I had to be convicted of my own bias that was hidden because I made an assumption about someone based on their looks and their appearance. And it was not until I spoke to the individual that they said that why their appearance was such, why the hair was cut short, is that they were undergoing medical treatment, which caused hair loss. That is not my first assumption, not what I assumed at first. Talk about an ouch moment. I had to shed a tear over my own actions and behavior. I had to tell myself I knew better. I wasn't doing better.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we talk to our young people someone has raised their hand. Can you see that, Danielle?
Yes, I can. Give me 1 second. Where'd she go? Okay. Miss Clark. Let me see. Okay.
Just going to say something concerning the little boy and what he dealt with, being biased. In my neighborhood, there was a little boy and his mother, and she was cursing the little boy out. And then she threw him out where he lived, and that doesn't help. I guess it was the mother that didn't have patience with the child, and she reacted that way, and she's a young adult with children.
Mm.
So I thought of that when you mentioned about the little boy and dealing with bias and the people at the store, you know, waiting outside of the store, a bunch of people, and I mean, where is he going to turn to? His mother put him out and cursed him out, and he was outside, and I mean, he looked like he was about 9 or 13 or something like that. So what do you do in a situation like that?
Well, may I call you by your first name?
Yes,
I think in that
yes.
one is a hard one to say specifically about what to do. But the mother's action to cuss out and to throw out is behavior learned. Sometimes that is when we've talked about that is how we learn when something does not work or we do not understand that is what we do, that we throw out. And if there was another adult around, have to always be careful because you don't want your intentions and well-meaning actions to come back. But if anyone in the community knew the mom, you could go and to talk to mom about what was about her actions. That would be the role. Certainly, a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old doesn't need to be thrown out because it reinforces the negative message, I'm sorry, that says that as a person that he is not worth and anything and that he does not matter. And that can lower his self-esteem, how he feels about himself, that he doesn't matter. And when something doesn't matter to you, you throw it away, you throw it out, and you throw it away.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. So as we talk about how to talk to our children, I really kept this very simple. And I think that the first one is just to practice what to say. You know, what will you say to your children? How will you say it? So practice. I think we need to keep in mind the age of our children when we're having a conversation, because their age and their ability to comprehend does matter, and where are they developmentally. So in practicing, I wouldn't use long words, big words. I wouldn't start talking about the Constitution necessarily to a 6-year-old, but I might have to condense it, make it simpler, and speak in a language that they would understand. The second is that you have to be prepared mentally and physically to have a conversation about racism, that you yourself have to be in a good headspace. I have to admit that last summer, I just mentally was not in a good headspace to be able to have a calm conversation without their anger and emotion. And I just was, I was just doing a whole lot of hate and a whole lot of anger. And I was just a mad sister. We also have to be physically rested, had a good night's rest. We're not hungry, but that we have to be prepared, not only what to say, but to be in a good headspace emotionally, as well as mentally. And number 3 is something that, whether we're talking about racism or anything when it comes to our interaction with children and even with each other, asking the question, how are they feeling? How do they feel? And in asking that, we have to be prepared to listen and to wait for them to respond. Many times we do it as adults. I can ask Danielle, how you feeling, Danielle? How you feeling today, Danielle? And before Danielle can say anything, I'm just like, hey, da 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 da. And I never gave her an opportunity to respond. And particularly today, because of racism and the heightened awareness of it, because of COVID, we're not asking people really how they feel. And we really need to be able to ask that question. And then lastly, it's about listening. I often say that when we listen, it is the gift that we are giving to someone else. Because in our homes, in our schools, wherever we go, nobody's really listening, and therefore we're not being heard. And so what we see happening is in order to be heard, folk are getting loud, raising their voice, making a fuss because they're not being heard, they're not being listened. Excuse me. So sometimes when children and even adults don't want to talk, they're going to avoid having the conversation. So this picture of this young boy, you can see that mom is talking, but if you look at his eyes, he's not trying to have eye contact. His head is down. He's really trying to avoid having the conversation. And sometimes they're going to avoid having a conversation. Excuse me, they may avoid it because they have watched your reaction on other things that may have happened in the home. So you may get excited, you may kind of not be in a good space, your own self, and you might really lose it when you hear some of their responses or what it is that they have to say. So rather than experience that, they will avoid having a conversation. You may ask them how they feel. You okay? And not have much to say. And they may be anxious about about what they might say. So anxious in terms of uncertainty about their own feelings and about their own thoughts. Anxious that if I tell you the truth, what's going to be the reaction? So there can be some anxiety about that. And certainly their friendships today may not, they may have diversity in their friendships. So some children may have persons who are of a different race and a different ethnicity. So to have that conversation, they might feel, and not really understanding what it is, what racism is, may not feel that they want to, talk about their friends whom they care about and they like. And then this last one is something that is really hard. I know growing up, my parents used to say to me, you can't have a closed door. You have no privacy. The door's got to be open. When you're in your own home, you can have all the privacy. So we do need to respect their need for privacy. And they may need to reflect and do their own internal processing. So we need to give them the space and the place and the time to think and to come up with their own thoughts. And this isn't anything that we just need to remember that. And we need to remember that with each other in our own interactions that we have with each other, even talking um, about racism and other issues that may come up. So feeling overwhelmed about racism. Remember last summer I said I was just ready to march in the streets, but COVID had me, and I was concerned about COVID and being in large spaces. So that's not what I did. But I did make sure that I voted because that is a right by which I have. I'm entitled to it, so to exercise my right to vote. And supporting Black-owned businesses that are in your community that we help to strengthen and to empower persons who want to serve our community. And again, sometimes I know that there can be a reputation about what happens when we support our own, but historically, way back in the day, within our community, they were nothing but Black-owned businesses by which we patronized and we served and we supported within our community.
Can I add
Sometimes,
something to
sure,
that
Danielle.
point? So I'm actually, in the fashion industry, retail industry, and what was so interesting to see that during this time and this movement, there were two Black owned handbag designers, one called Telfar, one called Brandon Blackwood, and they actually are the number two in terms of the most lucrative handbags out of like all designers, Dior, I mean, anyone you can imagine, because people really, really support them and supported them. So I thought that was really interesting to see that two Black owned companies in fashion are like the most lucrative and their resale prices are like sky high. So it's happening. It's happening.
Wow. And Danielle, you just told me something that I did not know because I did not know that fact.
Yeah.
And but how we support ourselves and how we support each other has really been the backbone of what we have done. And it's a part of who we are.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to be on the lookout for those two names. And the third is to practice gratitude. Sometimes, I know that the fight and the struggle has been hard, and we may feel like we don't get ahead, but we do have to be grateful for the things that we have, to be grateful for our family, to be grateful that we can send our children to school. We may argue and talk about the quality of education, but they have access to free and public education. To know that we are not restricted geographically to having to live in designated communities. It may happen that way, but we know that we are free to live anywhere that we want to, or that we have access to public transportation, that we are not working, um, you know, for 25 cents an hour, but that to remind ourselves of what we do have. And then the last is about being of service to someone, practicing random acts of kindness. Certainly when we think about our communities that might be in disarray, we might decide rather than to walk down the street and ignore a bottle that's on the ground, that we might decide to pick it up and put it in the trash can. We might observe a neighbor struggling to get groceries, out of the car. We might say, "Can I help you carry these groceries?" We may know of someone in our community that is going through a hard time. A random act of kindness might be that, we bring some extra groceries and leave it on their door. We may offer to give someone a ride. We may put a card or send a thoughtful text to someone else. But when we can do for someone else, it sometimes makes us feel better. And it also knows that we are doing something that is going to be of benefit to someone else. And I didn't put it in here as a slide, but really, if you are feeling overwhelmed about racism, about anything else that might be happening in your life, that it's always good to seek professional help. And whether that is from someone that you respect within your community, whether it is clergy, whether it is a mental health professional, whether it's someone in the medical community. But when you are really feeling overwhelmed and frustrated about racism, just emotionally not in a really good place, seek professional help to be able to reach out and to talk to someone.